Hey everybody, this is Neil Pasricha, and welcome back to chapter 31 of 3 books. What is 3 books? Well, it's my podcast. It's our epic quest over 15 years to uncover and discuss the world's 1,000 most formative books. We use those books as the underpinning for great conversations around life's biggest themes. We aren't looking for famous people, we're looking for interesting people. If they happen to be famous, fine. Some interesting people are famous, like Chapter 20 with David Sedaris, or Chapter 10 with Ilan Mastai, novelist and now a producer and writer for This Is Us. And sometimes they're remarkably interesting and I just bump into them, like Chapter 7 with Vishwas Agarwal, the world's greatest Uber driver, or way back in Chapter 4 with Sarah Ramsey, my favorite bookseller. We're publishing every single chapter of the show on the exact minute of every single new moon and full moon, all the way up to September 1st, 2031. We're wiring it live through, and I mean live, we're doing all the interviews live, and we're pumping them through 2 ears, your left ear, your right ear, so you can feel in the middle of the conversation. We're doing this with no ads, no sponsors, no interruptions, no commercials. We just want to uncover and discuss these books. And today, we have got a doozy for you because we're going all the way down to Omaha, Nebraska to sit down with former sex worker, PhD graduate, TED speaker, and author of the world's first ever children's book featuring a sex working parent, Juniper Fitzgerald. How did I get to know Juniper Fitzgerald? Actually, it all comes back to Chapter 4 of 3 books with Sarah Ramsey. Well, one day I'm browsing her bookstore and she hands me a children's book called How Mamas Love Their Babies. I trust everything Sarah gives me, so I flip through this children's book. It's beautiful, it's evocative, it's kind of like cut and pasted little pictures, and I'm totally gripped by it. I'm totally sucked in. I find the book fascinating and interesting, and to be honest with you, the mention of the sex working parent happens so gently and so subtly in this book. It's like, well, you hear us talk about it in the show, so I don't want to ruin the surprise, but it's interesting. So I reach out to Juniper. I fly down to Omaha, Nebraska. We actually meet up in the airport there, so you might hear some announcements in the background. And we sit down and have what, for me, was an extremely educational conversation about a number of topics, such as sex work, the pros and cons of sex work decriminalization, growing self-esteem, the real meaning of consent, how we teach children about sex, and so much more. To summarize Juniper's biography would be hard, but I did ask her for a little bio because there's not much online, and she says, Juniper is a mother, writer, artist, academic, and gadfly. She did her PhD in sociology with specific focuses on gender, sexuality, feminist, and queer theories. Her dissertation explored the experiences of sex workers in higher education. Juniper is also the author of numerous essays. I've read a lot of these essays in places like Vice, BuzzFeed, Tits and Sass, Pacific Standard, and Mutha magazine, and many more. Her children's book, How Mamas Love Their Babies, received rave reviews. It's very true. It's got all positive reviews online, and was highlighted in places like Bust magazine, Bustle magazine, and was called a patriarchy-smashing children's book by the editors at Ms. magazine. As mentioned, it was the first ever children's book to feature a sex working parent. Juniper spends her time, as much as possible, in her hometown of Omaha, Nebraska, with her fabulous, gender-expansive child. And you will hear us talk a little bit about her child in this show. I'm super excited to share Chapter 31 of 3 books with you. It is a different chapter in many ways, but that is the point of the conversation. We are trying to learn together and grow together, and I hope you feel like we did it in this discussion. Thank you so much, and now let's go. Okay, here we go. Hi, Juniper.
Hello.
Thank you for meeting me here at the Omaha airport.
The Omaha Epley
Never
Airport.
been to Omaha. Never been to the Omaha airport.
We have 2 terminals.
Really?
Yeah. Yep.
We're in Terminal B, right?
We're in Terminal B. A and B.
But there's only one bar. We tried to meet at the bar, but it was too loud. So now we're sitting in like this weird cubicle-y, like business person, faux privacy little setup here. I'm comfortable. Are you comfortable?
I'm comfortable. And, it actually reminds me of being a youth. And we used to come to the airport and act really weird. This is like, obviously before 9/11 when you could do stuff like that and not get arrested.
Like what?
Well, we were goth kids. So we would just come to the airport and like follow people around and stare at them.
This in Omaha?
Yes, here.
In Omaha, Nebraska.
Right here, yes.
Goth kids follow me around and staring at me, and then in the Omaha airport might freak me out, which is probably the goal, I guess.
That was our goal.
Yeah, make people uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Jolt them.
I guess I'm still doing that.
Yeah, you're a provocateur, like something like that. I'm not saying the word right, but like you provoke people in a good way, which is why I found your work, because actually it was funny because chapter 4 of 3 books was with my favorite bookseller in the world, Sarah Ramsey, who was at Book City in Toronto, and she moved to another bookstore called Another Story in Toronto. I was there the other day, a few months ago now maybe, and she's like, hey, have you read this book, How Mamas Love Their Babies?
Aww.
And I was like, no, but anything Sarah tells me to essentially buy, I just buy. It's a children's book, so I pick it up literally without reading it, take it home, read it. I'm blown away. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
The way the collages work, the writing, it's just the flow of it. It's great. I give it to my wife. She loves it. I look online. I see all the reviews at Bustle and Bust. And of course, Bust gave a glowing review. And let me get the number. Chapter 20 of this show was with the founder of Bust.
Yes, I listened to that.
Oh, did you? Debbie Stoller, right? So
yeah.
I'm like, okay, it's all coming full circle. So I was like, I got to have you on my podcast. And I've never had anyone on 3 books who is, obviously, this is the first ever children's book that discusses sex work in it, ever. And I've never had anyone on the show who is very open to talking about decriminalization of sex work and so on. And I see that all over your Twitter. So I'm like, are you willing to kind of help educate me and everyone about like kind of the issues you're so passionate about that you're communicating through the books? And you kindly said,
yes.
And here we are.
And here we are.
And here we are. How did you write this book, by the way? Like, where did this come from?
I have been thinking about writing a children's book featuring a sex working mother for years, even before I became a mother. So after I did become a mother, I would sit and rock my kid, breastfeeding them as they were falling asleep, and just on my phone write drafts. I mean, I think I have about 100 drafts of this book. And then by sheer chance, I got hooked up with Feminist Press.
But wait, why?
Oh, why?
Why? Not many people could say I've been dreaming about writing a book featuring a sex working mother. No, so why were you dreaming about that?
That's a really good question. I guess I forget that most people don't have that dream. I was a sex worker for a very long time, and almost everyone I worked with was a mother. And watching, kind of going from a very young person in the sex industry to an older person in the sex industry, watching the stigma that all of my colleagues and friends and peers were dealing with as a sex working mother was really intense. And I've been a lifelong feminist. I mean, this seemed like a story that feminists weren't telling, and there needed to be better representations of sex working mothers. So,
well, how do you define sex work?
So sex
I'm
work
going to
is...
ask a bunch of stupid
good.
questions.
I'm glad. Happy to answer them. So sex work is an umbrella term, and it encompasses any form of labor in the sex industry.
Like, give me the gamut. What's the range
So,
here we're talking about?
there's legal forms of sex work like stripping or porn work. There's illegal forms like escorting, depending on where you are in the world, or brothel work or whatever. So it just kind of, there's phone sex, there's...
And then you said you were in that industry,
I
working in
was.
sex work, and your peers, who most of whom were mothers, were experiencing a lot of stigma. Can you open that up for me a little bit? What kind of stigma?
Sure. So I would say that the overwhelming experience that I had, like with most people that I worked with would have an experience where their husband or partner would get pissed at them and use their sex work as a threat. I'm going to take the kids away because of your sex work, that kind of thing. And this is such an interesting backdrop. The
like
kind of
random
automate.
announcements. I know. We've done.
I love it.
Yeah, I think it'll sound cool, but you know what? The purpose of the show is to like always have the conversations live and in person.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we're in the back of a limo. Sometimes we're in. I went to Judy Bloom's bookstore in Key West.
I will listen to that one too.
You're great. So tell me about the stick. So the threat of taking the kids away was one, and you talk about that. You wrote an article for Vice magazine called "What It's Like Being a Mom and a Sex Worker," and you describe that losing children is a really common occurrence around the world for sex workers.
Yeah, sadly it is. And I remember, I was just a little baby stripper. I had to have maybe been 20. I don't even know if I was 20. And I was in the back room of this strip club.
Where were you?
This was actually in Omaha.
Okay.
I was working at a strip club here in Omaha. I was about 20 years old, and I was in the back room, and this woman was just sobbing and talking about how this was her only job. This was her only way of making money. And she was facing very serious consequences of that work. She was looking at potentially losing her children to a partner who wanted to use her sex work against her.
Is that the current law, that if you are in sex work, what is the current law?
So I wouldn't say that it is a law per se, but it is a practice. It is a common practice. Sex work is used as evidence of parental unfitness. And that's what judges will often say. It doesn't matter if you are, beaver cleaver mom in every other respect. If you're engaging in sex work, that's all a court needs usually to justify.
And you would argue that it's not the case. Obviously, you're saying sex work. You tweeted. I actually got this tweet from you on Mother's Day. You said, "Happy Mother's Day. Remember, being a slut, hoe, and/or sex worker is never indicative of one's parenting skills."
Exactly.
Say more about that to me.
So I think we have this conception, particularly for non-men, that sexual behavior is somehow indicative of a person's ability to parent, and it's really detrimental for women. It kind of goes back to the age-old Madonna whore complex, right? And this idea that women have to fit nicely.
Sorry, the Madonna whore complex?
Yes.
I don't know what that
okay.
is.
So this is the kind of dichotomy of womanhood. Women have to fit into these categories of this kind of private, asexual, beaver cleaver kind of mom, or the kind of wild, it's basically the good girl, bad girl thing. And you can't be both simultaneously. And if you try to be both simultaneously, if you try to be a mother and a sex worker simultaneously, well, you get punished. It's kind of that disciplinary punishment thing of the state.
And is that the stigma that you were most trying to address with how mamas love their babies?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely.
So you wrote this book. It's got a depiction of a sex worker in it. For those that have not read this book, which I love and highly recommend, you do so in a very, very light and gentle way. Some moms wear uniforms. Some moms dance all night. And it's hard work. It's kind of like, it's really sort of subtle. Almost. I mean, you could say that they're a ballet dancer almost. You could say lots of different perspectives, but clearly I'm assuming that the audience you've primarily written this for is like, finally, a breath of fresh air, because now, even though I may be working in the sex industry, I am acknowledged as being a great mother. What mother doesn't want that?
Absolutely. I think as mothers, we all want positive representations of ourselves and our labor. And something I've been thinking a lot about is how historically, the idea of good and bad labor has changed over time. Women could have been called a bad mother simply for wanting to work at all. And of course, that's different for white women and black women. Women of color have had a different experience with labor in the private and public spheres, of course. But just this conception of, or the kind of stigma that follows particular forms of labor is something that I want to address.
I love it. I love your courage too. You really put yourself out there. I read in this Vice article that you wrote that you experienced. It says, "I received death threats. Strangers have called Child Protective Services on me. I have been accused of practicing satanic witchcraft in order to coerce children into the sex industry. I am not alone. The juxtaposition of sex work and parenting makes a lot of people uneasy."
It sure does.
Including me. Like, I'm not but I'm just like, whoa, that's interesting to see those come together in a way that I'm not used to seeing.
Yeah.
Which I think was why this book really kind of struck me, and why Sarah maybe recommended it for me.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. If you think about the sex industry, we have a whole lot of, quote unquote jokes. I wouldn't think of them as funny necessarily, but we have all of these jokes about single mothers being strippers, right? So if we acknowledge that this is one of the main kind of jobs that single mothers do in order to survive and care for their children, why are we also then using that as evidence of their inability to parent? You know what I mean? Like, we're making a situation wherein this is the only kind of labor in a lot of cases that women can do to be a single parent.
I want to jump into your 3 books, but I want to kind of pause here too, because you are very actively in favor of decriminalization of sex work.
I am.
It's a big thing that you're talking a lot about on Twitter, and there's bills that you're discussing, and sort of the stance of U.S. presidential candidates and different bills. And so, can you educate or just illuminate for us kind of where that is today in the world, what your stance is, and kind of open that up for me? I tried reading and researching as much as I could before coming in here today, but I'd love to get the sort of like from the beginning kind of view on.
Sure. How much time do we have? No, just
kidding. Give me the shorter version of it, and then we'll keep talking.
So there are basically what's practiced around the globe is criminalization or partial criminalization. So even in places that like in Sweden, for example, they have partial criminalization. So sex work itself has been decriminalized, but the purchasing of things in the sex industry is criminalized. But I would actually say I advocate for anti-criminalization.
Okay.
Decriminalization is essentially removing all criminal penalties for people laboring in the sex industry and people purchasing the labor of sex workers.
Called the Johns. Is that right?
In some cases,
okay.
yeah.
Is that the right word?
Clients, customers,
okay.
yeah. But many of us argue for anti-criminalization because decriminalization is a policy, and policy change is fabulous, but you can't have policy change and no cultural change. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So even if decriminalization were to happen everywhere in the world, which is what Amnesty International has advocated for.
Oh, really? That's
yes.
Okay.
There would still be racist, classist, sexist, transphobic, larger social structures, So, for example, in New Zealand...
Why do you advocate for that? What are the benefits of that?
See, I told you I could talk about this forever.
No, I want to hear why. What are the reasons?
It's safer for everyone. It helps mitigate exploitation in the sex industry, despite what SWERFs, sex worker exclusionary radical feminists, say.
What's a SWERF?
A SWERF is a sex worker exclusionary radical feminist.
And they stand for a different view?
They stand for partial criminalization, so criminalizing the purchasing
Is this the sort of part of feminists that would say, hey, nobody goes into sex work kind of voluntarily.
Right.
If they're in that industry, it's against their will.
Absolutely.
They may not know that, but it's actually more protective of them to criminalize it is better because we're protecting them from being in that industry.
That's the argument.
And no, because I was trying to. And am I getting that right?
Yep.
And the counter argument or the argument you hold is.
I mean, my argument is pretty layered. I mean, first of all, I am anti-prison industrial complex, so I don't think that criminalizing ever works. I don't think that criminalizing buyers of any particular thing that a person is selling is beneficial to the seller. I mean, we know that, if you think about that in any other context, like if we decriminalized weed but threw people in prison for buying it, I mean, we would understand the problems inherent with that. Okay,
so your argument for the anti-criminalization is layered. One argument is against the prison industrial complex. What are some other because I've seen them on your Twitter and in your writing. The reason I'm asking you to open them up is so that our listeners can learn kind of what I've learned even in just the week or two I've been getting ready to chat with you today.
Well, again, so it mitigates.
So one thing is it doesn't. Hey, you get rid of that, then you're just moving it. Like it's not like the industry doesn't go away.
Right.
Right.
And it mitigates exploitation to have these kind of decrim or anti-criminalization ideas or policies, cultural changes, whatever. It helps to mitigate the violence in the sex industry. So
why is that? You said it makes it safer for everyone.
Absolutely. So. One example that I like to give, I interviewed a woman for my dissertation who had been trafficked into an illegal brothel in Alaska when she was a kid. I mean, she's like 12 years old. And all of the other women working there were of age, and they knew that something wasn't quite right, but they also couldn't just pick up the phone and call the police because they would have been held accountable. They could have been tried as traffickers themselves. So I want to make it easier for people who are already in the industry to report instances of abuse. Also, when you criminalize sex workers or their clients, you also create a situation in which police brutality runs rampant. I mean, if you're afraid of going to jail or you're afraid that your clients are going to go to jail, police officers can use that against you. We've seen this, those of us who have worked in the industry for a long time have seen this happen again and again.
What's the sort of the generic story version of what you're saying?
Like a cop will be like, hey, I won't take you to jail if you do something for me.
Oh, I see.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Because it's outside of the standard, I can call the police to protect me.
Right.
Actually, if it's outside, then everyone, not only is police brutality more rampant, but you're just outside the lines.
Yeah.
Because you retweeted a couple weeks ago, someone saying like, help, there's a violent person outside of our door banging on it. We can't call the police because we're in an illegal brothel.
Mm-hmm.
But we need some help. So I'm coming to Twitter, and people were retweeting this like wild. And I was fascinated by the idea that like this person's recourse is essentially like people on the other side of the world.
Yeah.
To help them.
Yeah.
And I understand what you're saying from that perspective. It's like they can't call the police.
Right.
Meanwhile, everyone deserves safety.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, think about clients who get violent, you can't call the cops when a client is violent. So it's just a bit of a nightmare. And it's always worse for people who are already socially marginalized, people who are working in already precarious, situations, made more precarious by virtue of criminalization.
And what's the counter argument you have? And I know it's very deep inside you, and I know I'm kind of asking kind of really basic questions on the they wouldn't be there unless they were forced to be. Mm-hmm. Your argument, as I think I've heard you say and write, is no, that's just simply not true.
Well, I would say that like any form of labor, it exists on a continuum, right? There are people. Right. I mean, I would never deny human trafficking. Human trafficking happens. Yeah. It happens into every labor sector, including agriculture. Like 80% is into agriculture, and then there are people who find fulfillment from the labor, or maybe even empowerment. That was never my experience, but there's all of this gray area, right? Yeah. Where you
can't declare an entire industry to be one way.
Well, yeah. I mean, now I'm in academia, and I'm like, God, some days I love my job, and some days I cry. I think we experience that in all forms of labor.
There was a Susan Sarandon tweet also a few weeks ago that you and I think thousands and thousands and thousands of others kind of retweeted, where Susan Sarandon, the famed actress, said, "Sex work is a job just like any other, but its criminalization exposes sex workers to discrimination, abuse, and exploitation. Talking about it is the first step to reducing the stigma, but decriminalization is the only way to implement safeguards to protect those in the industry."
I know. I asked her to marry me on Twitter, and she liked it, by the way. So we have a little registry.
That's a funny reaction if someone like if I got down on one knee and asked someone to marry me, and they're like, "I like that." Like, do you say yes or not? I like it. That's just kind of like, what do you mean? Are you in or not? Okay, there's a huge piece of conversation around sex work that you are. Thank you for letting me ask these questions, and also just for illuminating a little bit more. As you said, there's lots of gray, but how else do we learn other than asking kind of basic questions? And so thank you for your courage to kind of open that up for us, and thank you so much for sharing with me and all of our 3 Books listeners around the world your 3 most formative books. Okay. Are you up for jumping into them now?
Yes.
We will keep touching on these themes through these books, I am sure. The first one is Look for Me by Moonlight by Mary Downing Hahn. A quick overview is it's published in 1995 by Hodder and Stoughton. Mary Downing Hahn was born in Maryland in 1937. She's a former school librarian who's written over 20 young adult novels starting in the late 70s. The cover is 2 sort of ghostly-looking lovers, kind of looks like they're kissing, in front of a house under a purple dark sky. File this in Dewey Decimal under 813.54 American Fiction in English. And the super quick plotline is, when 16-year-old Cinda goes to stay with her father and stepmother in their remote bed and breakfast in Maine, she soon finds that the spooky legends abound there. A mysterious, attractive stranger comes to stay at the inn. So, tell us about your relationship, Juniper, with Look for Me by Moonlight by Mary Downing Hahn, which, by the way, I absolutely loved.
I'm so happy to hear that.
I was up late at night reading this gripping vampire, young adult, sort of sexualized book. Tell us about your relationship with it.
I would say, I remember this being incredibly erotic for me as a young person. And, you've gotten to spend a day in Omaha. As you can tell, this is a very interesting conservative place. So growing up as a queer kid in Omaha was very strange. And, I've been thinking a lot about this book, actually, and how as women, sometimes we can only explore our sexuality through this narrative of an older, attractive man kind of taking us under his wing, Like that's the acceptable kind of sexual exploration, because then you don't have to be accountable for it, because it's this vampire, who's kind of doing all the things. So, I think it's a great book. I think there are probably some problems with it.
Well, you read this as a teen. You were a queer kid growing up in Omaha, Nebraska. You said, it's a deeply red state. You didn't have you couldn't identify with a lot of the stuff. When I hear you saying, this book though also talks a lot about self-esteem. And I feel like this is like something I've noticed in books like 50 Shades of Grey and Girl on a Train. Is there's this like low self-esteem in women.
Mm-hmm.
Like page 6, I'm gawky, I'm all arms and legs, I'm far from pretty, I'm plain. Page 34, I always have trouble making friends, especially boyfriends. I'm shy, I'm not pretty enough. Page 53, why am I so shy? Why am I so clumsy? I'm like, it's the opposite of what you're doing with How Mamas Love Their Babies and what you're doing with your Twitter feed, which is all about women's confidence and empowerment and self-esteem. Why the huge gap between what we're writing about and people? I'm not saying what we're writing about because people identify with these books. The books sell really well. People I didn't read all of 50 Shades of Grey, but I read the first few pages of it, and I'm like, it's this woman who's like kind of in a really troublesome spot. What's up? Where is this? What's women's self-esteem at? What's the barometer at right now? Why? How do we? It's something I talked about with Debbie Stoller a little bit, but what are the ingredients in the recipe of improving and increasing self-esteem?
Oh, wow.
I'm focusing on women because that's just the books I reference, but it could also apply to men or anyone.
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I think that removing one's accountability as a femme for sexual desire is something that our culture kind of instills in us. Again, going back to the Madonna whore complex, right? To be a sexual agent is to because you render yourself stigmatized by kind of taking control of your own sexual agency. And so I think that that's why some of these vampire, or I would say BDSM light, I don't even know if 50 Shades is BDSM light so much as it's
BDSM heavy?
BDSM, not even BDSM? I thought that book was incredibly... that relationship was incredibly problematic, but it's interesting how 50 Shades of Grey is popular, but like Anais Nin wouldn't be sold at Barnes and Noble. You know what I mean? Like actual erotica where a woman is actively being a sub, as opposed to a woman kind of in an abusive relationship.
How do you define sub?
Like a submissive.
Submissive.
So Anais Nin was submissive.
And so is this book we're talking about.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So Look for Me by Moonlit, because the 16-year-old girl, there's this older gentleman. She kind of wants to sneak into his room, and she lets him take her away to the woods and start to kiss her and touch her, and she's 16 years old and she's really enjoying this. Mm-hmm. So that's the submissive element.
Yeah, but I just think that there's actual really good submissive writing, and then there's really bad submissive writing. And I think that maybe mainstream culture is attracted to the kind of bad submissive writing because the conversations about consent and the sexual agency of the woman are absent in the bad writing. And our culture wants women to be submissive in ways that are not consensual.
Consent is a fascinating word. For many reasons. My wife, Leslie, just bought a little children's book for our kids called C is for Consent.
Oh, we have that.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You have that? It's a great book.
It's great.
And I'm learning stuff. I was taught when you go to a party when you're a kid, like you have to kiss and hug all your aunts and uncles. And I always never really liked that when I was a kid, but it was just part of like the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And this book is like teaching you like, I just feel like giving you a high five today, or like, I don't have to touch anyone if I don't want to. And I'm like, what a good thing to teach kids. But I didn't know that. So, but consent is interesting because I'm reading this book. It's like a 16-year-old woman. And the man she falls in love with is clearly like middle age. Actually, turns out he's 500 years old because he's a vampire. And they engage in all the kinds of consensual, presumably like kissing and touching, and he bites her neck, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, I don't know much about like age of consent. I realized like, is this illegal? Is it not? So I look it up. Turns out, I don't know if you know this, you probably do because you're way more educated on this stuff than I am. But the age of consent in Canada is 16. In as of last year, every U.S. state has its own age. 16, 17, or 18. So I look it up internationally. I'm fascinated by it. I'm like, what is the age of consent? Which is the age that you can say that you are engaging in sexual activity through your own agency, through your own purpose. Well, the low end is like Nigeria and Philippines. It's like 11 and 12. Okay. The highest end is like Portugal, which is 21, and even higher are like about 20 countries which say you have to be married in order to consent, including Pakistan, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. So if you never get married, you can never consent.
Wow.
Right? Ever. Right? You have to be married, and then only then can you consent to kind of being in sexual relationship.
That's interesting.
So I'm like, whoa, we're in one world. We're one species. We're one kind of people. We've all been evolving in the same amount of time. And yet around this world, we have a huge variance on what we think is the sort of age of consent. And it ranges from 11 to like kind of never.
Yeah, you know? Right.
What's the deal? How do we open this up? How do we determine that? And also, how does this fit in with the culture today, which is like kind of, I don't know what the word is, like sexualizing younger and younger people. Mm-hmm. So like a younger and younger person are like now more sexualized in imagery and advertising and media and how they're dressing. Open this up for me. I want your education and your view on this.
Well, I mean, I would definitely say that children have a sexuality. I knew I was queer when I was very, very young. So, you know, age of consent is a really interesting topic because, of course...
How do you define queer, by the way?
Queer?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, liking
different
everyone.
From the norm?
Liking everyone.
Okay, liking everyone. Okay, good.
Big old slut. So... What was I saying? Oh, age of consent. So this idea
have
of
sexual
sure,
emotions.
yes. So,
okay.
I think the thing about what age of consent misses is that I think we do need to protect children from predatory people. Absolutely. I mean, obviously. But I also think that young kids experiment with each other, and there's such a taboo around that. You know, parents get weird about it and kind of punish their children for experimenting with their friends or whatever. And I think the better approach would be, you know, I have a 5-year-old, and I always try to tell them, you know, you have to ask. You have to have a conversation with your friends. If you all want to run around the house naked, that's fine, but we have to have a conversation about it.
So you're
I don't
saying,
know if I answered your question.
You're saying, no, I think it's interesting what you're saying. You're saying seek consent.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of one principle. And then it's like, don't disallow much once you have consent. Meanwhile, there's an age of consent around the world. And some of the things say, you know, within years, like it was uncomfortable for me reading this book because the way I grew up was like a 16-year-old woman and a middle-aged man. That's like not allowed.
Right.
Like that sounds like kind of child porn or like kind of sounds like rape. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And what I learned by looking into it is it depends where you are.
Right.
Which I thought was interesting. And then I'm like, well, if it depends where you are, and if age is the only barometer we're using on maturity, even though physically people can look totally different at age 18, for example. Mm-hmm. A 14-year-old can look like an 18-year-old, an 18-year-old can look like a 14-year-old. Like, there is no absolute anything. So we're using age as this bizarre metric, but it doesn't even work. So now what do we do?
But you know, so it's a bizarre metric, but at the same time, as somebody who used to date much older people, I think there is, as I am aging myself, I realize how problematic those relationships were. And I mean, there's a crisis with masculinity, I think. I think that part of masculinity, at least in the West and contemporary culture, is kind of values innocence and purity. And I think that's the kind of attraction to younger people. I read this great essay about how men don't like younger women because they're more attractive, but because they're more likely to, glorify the older man. So it's that kind of glorification that they're looking for, which a lot of younger...
What's the root issue there? Or what's the root desire? You said crisis of masculinity. Men are looking
masculinity is kind of destroying y'all. I mean, you're a great guy. But
no. I want to learn. Tell me more. I may or may not be. I'm just trying to learn what open that up for me more. I agree with you, by the way. There's this commercial the other day I saw that was Procter & Gamble. It was Gillette. And they're sort of poking their old slogan about the best a man can get. Because that was the old slogan, Gillette. And they show like the old days are like, boys will be boys and let them wrestle and like, oh, that's just what they do on prom night. And then the new way that they're saying is break up the kids that are fighting, and you know what I mean. I watched that with my wife, and she's like, that's great. And I talked with my guy friends, and they're like, whoa, that's like really kind of preaching to men that what they're doing very naturally sometimes at a young age is like totally not okay. So like there's this really like. There's this thorny issue. You call it crisis of masculinity.
Yeah.
You know,
I think men are just trained. You know, you guys have a lot of expectations for sure. I mean, you guys created patriarchy, so I don't want to give you too much empathy. But you're kind of trained to always be afraid of failure. And I think that aids in this kind of attraction to younger women, because younger women are never going to see your failures. Because when we're young, we're ignorant and exuberant and optimistic about everything. So anyway, that was an interesting circle.
Yeah,
thought,
and that's not the goal of these conversations isn't to evaluate what we're saying. It's more just like open. I want to get to some of these issues, touch them. We're trying to use books as the like lever to talk about like what's going on in the world, the bigger issue at times. So let's jump from this to your second book, which is Public Sex: The Culture of Radical Sex.
So yes, I love that transition from this to Pat Califia's work.
Pat Califia, published in 1994 by Kleis Press, CLEIS. Pat Califia is a bisexual trans man who writes nonfiction essays about sexuality and erotic fiction and poetry. His writings explore sexuality and gender identity and have included lesbian erotica and works about BDSM culture. The cover is a yellow background with public sex written in black, and the black and white image of two people kissing in a tunnel. File this in Dewey Decimal under 306.7, Social Sciences, Culture, Sexuality. Juniper, tell us about your relationship with Public Sex by Kat Califia.
Patrick Califia, who is a lovely man. I remember reading, this book just opened my eyes. I will never forget the first time I read it. I've read it about 20 times now. But particularly the essay Whoring in Utopia. That was incredible for me.
What's that essay about? So share what the essay is about.
So Patrick Califia talks about a utopic society, what would utopia look like? And he argues that even in a utopia where, everything is equal and equitable, that people would still engage in sex work. That was fascinating for me as a young feminist to think about exchanging sex for money as a kink, which is not how we often think of it. I mean, of course, that's just one experience. Not everybody has that experience in the sex industry. But trying to really think about utopia and why we have this conception of, as feminists, of equitable relationships, not including commodified relationships.
So right now in society, for the most part, when we think of equitable relationships, we don't think that sex for money would be part of that.
Right.
And you're saying in the most equitable relationships, you would also include that.
Yes.
Sex, right.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
I'm an anti-capitalist, so I would hope my utopia would not have any form of currency, or at least a form of currency that creates hierarchies. But I think that thinking of sex as only something people do for love is a really Western recent idea. Sex can be labor. It can be a lot of things. People engage in sex for a lot of different reasons.
Some of them being labor.
Right.
And open it up for me, because you're right. I grew up with that idea that like it's in the movies, like sex is the culmination of love.
Right.
Say,
Right.
You're saying, no, it's been a lot of other things for a lot of other years.
Sure. I mean, it's been political. It's been about, connecting countries, power. Sure. expansive as human beings themselves.
Okay. And complicated and
Yeah.
multifaceted. Okay, so his work is then opening up the idea of what sex could be for you when you read this at a younger age.
Yeah. And kind of comparing it to this, Look for Me by Moonlight, this idea of submissive femininity as the only kind of femininity I thought I could have. And then reading Patrick Califia's work on BDSM and, really diving into this culture of BDSM and realizing that it's not just about submissive femininity. Like I found myself, my kind of dominant nature and my submissive nature through reading Patrick Califia.
So people that are listening that have the view I grew up with on the sort of westernized notion of sex and love, kind of solely, but are listening to you and kind of like how dimensionalized you think about sex, how expansive it is, and so what are the ways that people open that up? Because it seems to me, and I know in chapter 6 of the show with Judy Blume, like we actually we rued the fact that there's like no sex scenes in books anymore. People learn it primarily through pornography. What are the avenues that someone does develop a healthy and more broad relationship with sex as a whole? How would you coach or parent your own child to develop a positive and broad relationship with sex?
Well, first of all, here in the United States, we don't have comprehensive sex education everywhere. So that would be a good start for us to have comprehensive sex education. But also when I think about my own child, I want my own child to know their own pleasure, first and foremost. I think as parents, we often get really weirded out by like kids masturbating and stuff. And I actually want my child to know what kind of pleasure they enjoy.
That's one of the most provocative issues in sex ed, right? Do you teach masturbation or not? And
for, my child was assigned female at birth. For children who are assigned female at birth, to not find one's own pleasure means that somebody else is going to define it for you. And it's going to be based on their pleasure. So I think that's where I would start.
How do you coach that? How do you teach kids that? What age and how?
I don't think you have to teach kids how to find their pleasure. I think kids are naturally curious about their own bodies. So
part of it's just not saying no. Not
exactly.
Saying stop that.
So in our household, I say things like, you can touch yourself, you have to go in your room, and that's something you do in private, okay? And I'll see you later.
What are some other Juniper parenting philosophies? You wrote How Mamas Love Their Babies. It's the first children's book ever to depict a sex worker, which I think is very progressive and very progressive and provocative in a way that necessarily shouldn't have been, but you did it. You opened that wall. You're a parent. You shared something very, very personal there, which I really appreciate. You're saying like you can touch yourself, you can go to your room. I love that. I think that's amazing.
Thank you.
What are some other parenting philosophies that you have that you find are lesser believed by other people? Like, is there something other things you do? I heard one there, which is assigned female from birth. So you refer to your child as non-binary. So we can get into that maybe if you want to talk about that.
So ever since my child started talking, which by the way, their first words was "what's that?" which I just think is so lovely. But I've been asking them what pronouns they would like daily. So that's one thing that most people probably wouldn't agree with. But every day I ask them what pronouns they want to use. And I think that is also about instilling.
What pronouns do they want to use? Is it
typically they?
They? Because?
They don't feel like a boy or a girl.
Wow. Because and there's a lot of research that shows that we don't have a gender for quite a while after birth. Is that like people are assigned to sex and then a gender more evolves.
Yeah, and also
I'm
kind of expectations.
So conscious of how stupid I sound here, but
no,
I'm asking.
you don't sound stupid.
Tell me more, like because there's like gender reveal parties. You cut a cake and it's like blue on the inside. You're having a boy, but actually, what you're saying is like, how would you possibly know the kid's gender so far before they know it themselves?
I know. I'm really fun at parties, actually. Like when people are pregnant and have these kind of gender reveal parties, I'll be like, actually, you're not going to know that kid's gender until they're older. But yeah, we're kind of obsessed.
And they might change it.
Yeah, absolutely. We're kind of obsessed in our culture with gender. I could talk about that all day long.
Yeah, dude,
but
just give me a spill. Give me like
people,
a little,
what's interesting? I'll give you a story. Okay, so Disney films, right? The male characters and the female characters. What's fascinating about those characters is not that the men are so manly and the women are so girly. It's the difference. You know, the man's hands will be as large as a woman's waist. Like emphasizing,
Beauty and the Beast. I'm thinking of
Like that is the one Disney film that I like, written by a feminist, by the way. But it's, you know, they're trying to show how different, like exaggerating these differences. So I think that that's part of our obsession with gender.
Fred and Wilma Flintstone.
Yeah. You know, that's part of our obsession with gender. We want to so badly believe that men and women are so different.
It's funny because we talk a lot about breaking diversity or breaking these ceilings all over television and film, and people applaud when there's, you know, sort of gay characters and they're starting to be more. But you never have seen ever in a movie or a TV show once a version of a couple that I have all over my life, which is like sort of a smaller and more effeminate man with say a larger woman, you know, or even something as innocuous as that. You never see that. That's like an totally absent relationship. But meanwhile, I'm like, I have so many friends and relationships that sort of look like that. I'm projecting all kinds of language stuff, but I'm like, even more subtle things like that are just missing.
Yeah. I think Wreck-It Ralph had a kind of smaller male character and a larger female love interest.
Wreck-It Ralph, the bastion of progressiveness the world over. Good work, Ralph. Cool. We can, because you tweet I keep grabbing your tweet because, by the way, I noticed you were like prolific on Twitter. You were like, and I wondered if it's partly like a community around the world that is largely invisible, choosing online channels to get together.
Oh yeah.
That's what I noticed. And anyway, I don't know if I'm projecting that on you. Or
oh
if
no,
right?
Definitely.
Like,
I mean, it's such
like
a
sex workers around the world. It's like, here we are online.
Right.
We found each other.
You know, when you're criminalized, it's one of the only places to go to have community in some situations. And also, what's really interesting is this practice of shadow banning. Twitter shadow bans sex workers all the time.
What's shadow banning?
It's where you can't find basically other sex workers.
Okay.
Even if you know their handle or whatever, it'll come up.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. But I do think that is a targeted attack on our community to prevent us from having the kind of amazing community that we
How do you find other sex workers?
I mean, it depends on the level of their shadow ban, but
like you're looking for you're looking for people like you around the world. How do you find them?
Well, I'm involved in a lot of organizing, so I would say that that's mainly how I meet people. And, you know, porn conferences and stuff like that.
Porn conferences. Okay.
Yeah.
What are porn conferences?
Porn conferences.
Yeah, but what is a porn conference? What do you do at a porn conference?
Oh my God, it's fabulous. AVN, you've never heard of AVN?
Adult Video Network or Adult Film Industry?
So it's just a bunch of sex workers getting together.
For what purpose? What's the goal?
Well, it's a award ceremony.
It's awards. Okay.
Yeah.
I thought it was like union orienting and
you know,
like that.
I wish.
Okay.
we do all of that stuff as well.
Okay. Cool. Well, a lot more to that's an entire other podcast is learning about the sort of the community aspects of the world stream. Okay. Cool. How about your third book then? Let's go over to The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. Did I say that right? No. Ursula. Published by Ace Books in Ursula Le Guin, is that right? Okay, published by Ace Books in 1969. Le Guin lived from 1929 to just 2018 last year. American author, best known for her works of speculative fiction, including sci-fi, set in her Hainish universe. You can file this under 813.54 American Fiction in English. This is one of the few books that has ever won both the Hugo and the Nebula Awards for Best Science Fiction, and it's a groundbreaking work. The Left Hand of Darkness tells the story of a lone human emissary to Winter, an alien world whose inhabitants can choose and change their gender. Embracing aspects of psychology, society, and human emotion, The Left Hand of Darkness stands as a landmark achievement in the annals of intellectual science fiction. So, Juniper, tell us about your relationship with The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin.
Oh my goodness. What a fabulous book.
1969.
I know. Isn't that wild? To think of a woman writing this kind of sci-fi. I mean, sci-fi has been a field dominated by men, and she was writing in the 60s. But I guess your description kind of probably explained my relationship. I mean, the changing of genders.
When did you read it?
I read it for the third time about a year ago.
What prompted you to read it again?
I was actually going through a bit of darkness myself, and just really, I've always been attracted to sci-fi, big sci-fi nerd, and I just kind of wanted to lose myself in these other worlds again.
The book does that. You read it and you're like totally somewhere else, and then without much explanation, like you get lost in a chapter till the end when it kind of like reveals what the whole chapter was about, or they refer to things that aren't explained
I know.
for quite a long time. And this sort of gender thing we were talking about earlier, but the inhabitants can choose and change their gender. So this book became a landmark partly because it provoked. It's called feminist sci-fi. It provoked a lot of conversation that nobody was having about gender and identity. This is in the '60s. And you had a tweet, which I loved and I wanted to read. It says, my kid, this is you, my kid who is non-binary just informed me that they have a fiance. I congratulated them, but I also added, it's important to nurture your friendships too. They responded, yeah, no duh, Mom. We're all engaged to each other. You can have more than one husband. Do we really live in this post-gender world that we're talking about now? I know the pronouns have kind of come up as a newer thing. For a lot of people, they find them tricky to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
I do personally. I'm like, I'm worried about making a mistake. I'm worried about when I see like when my kid's playing with another kid at the park. I'm like, oh, did you get his toy? And I'm like, oh, I don't know if it's a his. It looks like a boy. Are they identifying as a boy? Like, whoa, like it's added a complexity. So take me into this gender element of the story. How do we navigate the world today? What are ways that beginners like me can sort of get comfortable and situated? Not that I need to be made comfortable, but like, what are ways that I can, and people like me can sort of like, what's the way to operate now in this post-gender world that we're walking into here?
I don't know that I would say post-gender.
Okay, correct my language.
I wouldn't say that my child is without gender.
Right.
I would say that they are gender expansive or encompassing of all genders is how I would define my child's gender. They can define it for themselves when they get a little bit older and have a bigger vocabulary. But so I think that a really great place to start is never assuming a person's gender and always asking pronouns.
So you start with they. Hey, you grab their toy.
You could.
That's the starting point.
Yeah.
If my son grabs another kid's toy, I should say you grab their toy.
Yeah.
Do you then ask? Is it okay to ask or
ask
not?
pronouns, absolutely.
So you say,
Yeah.
what's the question? How do you say that? How do you like to be referred?
No, you just say, what are your pronouns?
You make it sound
And
so
then
simple.
if you're in
you make
Omaha,
it sound
Nebraska.
you make it sound so simple. Like everyone asks that and everyone answers that. I've never been asked or answered that.
Well, I would love to see a world where we ask that of each other.
Me too. I think it's becoming more common. I'm starting to see on Twitter now people say, he and him.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or in email signatures and corporations.
Yes.
That's like a pretty radical place, right? Like you're like, I'm in a company. When I started at Walmart back in 2006, below everyone's signature, for the most part, they had a Bible quote.
Oh my God.
In their email signature. Yeah, literally.
Yeah.
No, and I'm not judging that, but I'm just saying that was the place when I started at work. Not that long ago, it was usually a Bible quote underneath an email signature.
Wow.
Now it's a personal pronouns.
Yeah.
How far we've come.
I think so.
Very quickly.
Yeah.
What do you say to people that don't think we've come far, that we're retracting, that we're getting too complicated? What do you say about, there's people that are making quite a name for themselves, denouncing this kind of world of sort of pronoun complexity. What's the counter?
You always have trolls. I mean, people are, that's why I would never say we're in a post-gender society, because people are so threatened by movements towards expanding our understanding of gender. They're threatened because they fit nicely into this kind of binary system, and for the most part have probably been able to oppress others through that binary, and they're afraid of losing their power, would be my, that's my hypothesis anyway. But yeah, I mean, at the playground in Omaha, Nebraska, asking other kids what their pronouns are usually means that we get stares and parents snatch their children up and leave quickly.
And yet you've not chosen to live somewhere that's sort of, more urban or you're here. by
I'm
choice.
here. Yeah.
Right?
It was, yeah.
And then,
Yeah.
my experience at Omaha has only been fantastically positive. Everybody I've met has been super friendly. Everyone's very kind. I left the hotel to go give a speech, and they're like, "Can we drive you there?" I'm like, "It's across the street." They're like, "It's raining," and then they're like, "Let me drop you off where there's an over." I mean, these people are warm. They're kind. They're friendly. They're loving. They're just all I sensed was positivity. What you're saying is it's out of the norm to operate in. You're really progressive, right? Like you're
Oh, yeah.
right, and you make me not uncomfortable, but like I feel tiptoey because I'm so afraid of like messing up.
Oh, that's so interesting.
I want what you have and how you're advocating it, and that's why I'm attracted to your work and your art and I'm excited to see your TED Talk, and I love the world you're walking me into, but I do so from a place of caution because I'm so afraid of messing up
Oh, thank you for saying
or
that.
looking stupid.
I'll tell you a story. I got called out for something that I should have been called out for. And I just
What was it?
immediately
What are you
felt
talking about?
I got called out for somebody was experiencing something negative in academia, and I was like, "Oh, there's a lot of people doing cool stuff in academia too." It was kind of like this not all white people thing, and I totally own it. And being called out for that felt so bad, and I felt like, oh God, I have to tiptoe around all this stuff. I never want to make a mistake like that again. And then somebody was like, Juniper, do you know how difficult it is for that person to walk through the world as a person of color? You know what I mean? So like messing up is nothing compared to what the horrible feeling of messing up is nothing compared to the horrible feeling of walking through the world as a marginalized, criminalized, stigmatized person. So I always keep that in mind when I'm learning.
What do you mean by
new
that?
things.
I agree with what you're saying, but you're saying, hey, messing up is the only pathway to learning. Messing up is the only pathway to growth.
Absolutely.
Messing up and being ignorant, asking them questions is the only way to get more informed.
Absolutely. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And then only from a place of being more informed can we then have debates and discussions and disagreements because we're now at the same, we had the same sort of base level of understanding. And so you've been very patient and very kind in answering all these kind of, I called them dumb questions, but you're saying that's the only pathway to learning.
Absolutely. And how else do we learn? we have to sit with the fact that we don't know everything, I think.
And the world is changing so fast. Like that's the other part of the problem is like, I'm like, it feels like I could go to sleep for 2 weeks and I'd wake up and like everything will be different. And there's a lot of work being done on like keeping up with what is the current way to do things well.
Yeah.
I mentioned the Bible quote under the email signature, changing to personal pronouns. That's a very short timeline.
Totally.
There's people that have not caught up with that. There's people that disagree with that. There's people that are hardcore on the Bible quotes at their corporate job, right? Like it's like, so now you've got therefore more also stress in the system too, because there's more disparity in the system.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not easy.
We're not all going to go to the same place is what I'm saying.
Right. But I don't know. A good rule of thumb for me, though, is listening to the most marginalized people. They tend to understand society better than people who are privileged and have a better idea of how to dismantle oppressive systems.
Seek to find the most marginalized people. Seek to listen to them and seek to grow yourself.
And support the work that they're doing. Yeah.
Juniper Fitzgerald, thank you so much for coming on 3 Books. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you. This was lovely. Thank you.
Hey everybody, it is just me. It is just Neil again. I am back in my basement with my backpack full of wires, listening to and reflecting on that conversation with Juniper Fitzgerald. It was eye-opening and mind-opening in many ways. I can't wait for your thoughts and your feedback on it. I want to give a big shout out and a big thanks to Juniper for being up for having this chat in the airport. Not dressed in her goth face paint that she mentioned she used to do when she was younger. And thank you to Juniper for giving us number 912, Look for Me by Moonlight by Mary Downing Hahn. Number 911, Public Sex, The Culture of Radical Sex by Pat Califia. And number 910, The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. As you know, you can go to 3books.co. That's the number 3, BOOKS.co, 3books.co, and there you will find the list of the top 1,000 books. On our countdown, Juniper's added 3 more, and we are getting closer to the first 100. We're over a year into it, so we're finally at almost the first 100, but we got a few shows to get there. This was a powerful chapter, an educational chapter. And finally, before I go, one last huge thank you to Juniper Fitzgerald. If you haven't already, please do check out her children's book, How Mamas Love Their Babies, or tweet to her online at Juniper Fitz. That's JUNIPER FITZ or Z, depending where you live or how you say that last letter. Thank you, everybody, so much. Take care. And now, if you've made it to this far in the podcast, it's time to welcome you back to the end of the podcast club. Yes, this is one of 2 clubs we have for 3 Books listeners. The other club is, of course, our secret club. You can't talk too much about that. But I will say, if you call our phone number, you can find out more. Our phone number, of course, is 1-833-READ-A-LOT. Yes, that is a real number. Yes, we pay for that phone number just so people around the world can give us a call. We love getting your calls. And now, as always, let's start off the end of the podcast club by going to the phones.
Neil, my brother, it's Joey Coleman calling from Boulder, Colorado. Just wanted to say, I love your podcast, man. You know, as somebody who has a podcast of his own, I don't even listen to my own show as religiously as I listen to yours. Every time it comes out, I'm eager to listen on the first night that I'm home and it drops while I'm doing the dishes, as you know. And it's just, you're putting together something that is so beautiful and is so special. I recommend your podcast all the time. I love what you've created, what you continue to create. I love how it's evolving over time. I just listened to your most recent episode, the one with Angie Thomas, who was, you know, I was familiar with the book and I had seen the movie and just loved the way you went at the questions with such an open heart and an open willingness to learn. It's inspiring. It's inspiring. And then when I thought it could get no better, reading the letter from the doctor at the end, and you said you were tearing up. I was tearing up in my kitchen. What you're doing is magical. It is helping people. It is meaningful. It is certainly increasing book sales around the world because every time I listen to a show, I end up buying at least one of the 3 recommended books, if not multiple, depending on which ones I've read and am familiar with. And I just wanted to say I appreciate you, man. I admire you. And now I'm going to go use Papercut to join the Analog Club because I think that's awesome. And I've been meaning to do it for a long time. And tonight I was like, it's time to call and leave Neil a message.
Thank you so much to Joey Coleman from Colorado. Joey, you make my heart swell, man. You do. It makes my heart get bigger, and you make me remember and feel kind of how and why I'm doing this. Because I forget. We all forget. We all forget what we're doing sometimes. Sometimes I'm slow to start projects, right? Like I'm like, I was thinking about this podcast for a long time, right? Before I even did anything. And the whole time I'm watching all these millions of podcasts, I'm like, I really want to get it right. And so for me, it was like deciding to go no ads was a big decision. Deciding to publish on Lunar was a big decision. Deciding to go for a 2x2 matrix of sort of interesting and or notable, but I don't want notable and not interesting. Like I was sort of really trying to think about how I want the guest composite to look like. Anyway, all that being said, it's huge love in, and it's so gratifying to hear that the huge love is coming out. You, I can tell by your heart and your voice, are a deeply loving person. It's so great to connect this way. I really appreciate the call. Okay, now, where should we go? Should we go to the review? The review of the chapter. I said review again, didn't I? What, of course, I meant was letter. You will remember a few chapters back when I said, I don't want just reviews. I'm not going to beg people for reviews. I love reviews, but I'm not going to beg for them. It's letters. You can leave me an email. You can leave a comment on a YouTube video, send a tweet, whatever. Okay. So this chapter's letter comes from Mr. Mike 298, left on iTunes in the United States. He gives the podcast 2 stars. The subject line is difficult listening, all caps. Good guests, but Mr. Pasricha has the annoying habit of repeatedly interrupting them just as they are beginning to answer. It's as if he wants to show off how well he can anticipate where they're going by jumping in to get there first. It's extremely frustrating. Damn, what a come down from the Joey Coleman phone call. But great feedback. Honestly, I know I do this. I don't want to do it. I'm trying to get better at it. I'm trying to learn and studying interviewers all the time. It's not because I'm trying to show off how well I can anticipate where someone's going. Actually, that's not it at all. It's because I'm there in person with a guest. I can read their body language, and sometimes they're struggling to put something out, and I just so want to please, or I so want to help them, or I so want to help them back to the thought they were having, or show them the path that I think they're trying to fumble towards. But in doing that, I am, of course, maybe to your point, I am showing off in a way because I'm trying to help them too much, and I should just let the pauses hang more. Like this, or like this. Mr. Mike, I appreciate the 2 stars out of 5. That's 40%. 40%, that's a failure rating. But as always, I want to read good and bad letters. That's the only way to get better. Thank you so much for the letter. And as always, Mr. Mike, drop me a line. It's a free book for you. Free book for anyone that leaves a letter for the show. Okay, now let's go to the word of the chapter.
And also, what's really interesting is this practice of shadow banning. Twitter shadow bans sex workers all the time.
Yes, indeed. It is shadow banning. When Juniper used that word, I had no idea what she was talking about. So we go over to Wikipedia. We want to look it up. Let's talk about it, people. Shadow banning, also called stealth banning, ghost banning, or comment ghosting, is the act of blocking or partially blocking a user or their content from an online community such that it will not be readily apparent to the user that they have been banned. By making a user's contributions invisible or less prominent to other members of the service, the hope may be that in the absence of reactions to their comments, the problematic or otherwise out of favor user will become bored or frustrated and leave the site. Interesting origin here, back in the mid-1980s, BBS forums, so precursors to sort of online forums, but just local BBS forums, including Citadel BBS software, had a twit bit. It was called for problematic users. When enabled, the user would have limited access and commonly still be able to read public discussions. However, any messages posted by the twit would not be shown to other users of that group. There's a ton of examples on Wikipedia. Of course, there's been a lot of debate of whether or not Twitter does this. And of course, Twitter has said, no, we don't do this. But Vice magazine says, yes, they do. Here's some examples. They've showed screenshots where people have posted and they can't be viewed or searched from other platforms. Twitter has said, you can go to the person's actual Twitter homepage and you can still find what they're tweeting. But this is a huge, interesting issue. Juniper's bringing it up here. If you are a sex worker on one side of the world looking to find your community of other sex workers and you can't find them because the service you're trying to find each other on is shadow banning them, that raises a ton of interesting ethical and moral questions, which we did not